Hi, hello, my name's Tama Lever. I'm from Curtin University and I'm pleased to be presenting this very short provocation rather than paper. We've been given the brief to be 3 to 5 minutes. And my provocation is about creating each other on Instagram. It's part of the Approaching Instagram Roundtable, which was very much set up with the idea of thinking about not just Instagram research, but challenges for Instagram researchers. I am from Curtin University and I am the Discipline Lead for Internet Studies and a researcher within the Centre for Culture and Technology. And what I am asking you to think about very briefly today is the way that we all on social media create each other as much as we create ourselves. So there is this sort of implicit idea that social media should be regulated in terms of thinking that everyone is responsible for their own self-creation, their own self-direction, if you like. Whereas if we stop thinking about social media platforms as just creating ourselves, but as also creating each other, it sort of changes the game a bit. In the Instagram book that I co-authored with Tim Highfield and Crystal Aberden, we talk about this at some length. And one of the examples we use is the idea of parents as co-creators. So the idea that parents effectively name and share their children into being. This begins with often children's early identity starts on Instagram with a sharing of ultrasounds before, of course, that child is even born. We see a range of practices. Tim Highfield and I did a study looking at ultrasounds, for example, and we found that approximately 1/3 of publicly shared ultrasounds included all of the metadata, so the mother's name, the hospital, the doctor's name, the expected date of birth, things like that. So there was a sort of a very normalized public sharing right from the beginning. This also dovetails into debates around sharenting, around the idea of should parents be sharing as much about kids as they do, and what is that tension? Should children have an implicit right to privacy or not? And how does that change over time? And also in the book, we looked at parental influences, because often the practices of parental influences, whether they do or don't share the faces of their children, whether they show them in fashion, whether they include them in advertising, really sets the tone for other people as well. At the other end of life, we also considered the question of what happens at death or memorialization, which is another moment where it's not the user themselves that is defining their social media presence. Now, obviously, Instagram users die, and often they leave behind a very rich visual story of their lives. The question of what happens to this content and what can continue to happen to this content is part of the grieving and mourning process. Some people, for example, reshare the content of deceased users, so they will go and use the reshare function to push it into their own personal stories on Instagram as part of the mourning ritual, whether immediately afterwards or perhaps annually remembering them. We also see people leaving comments, new comments on a deceased person's posts as sort of a way of remembering and mourning them. And it asks some big questions about should mourners or immediate family be able to request the data from Instagram accounts of deceased loved ones? Should they be able to just delete a deceased user's account, for example? And interestingly, in our pandemic times, we have just seen that the rules have changed a bit on Instagram, and they've actually just started to mimic some of Facebook's functionality in that you can now memorialize an account, and we can have that sort of remembering word imposed on an account of a deceased Instagram user, and that begs some very new questions that we've only just started exploring about how those remembering accounts are being thought of and managed. So the lens that I suggest here and that we work through in the book and I've worked through elsewhere is the idea of co-creation. So if we stop thinking about social media use as creation for ourselves or just ourselves, but as co-creation of other people, then it really changes the game and changes the way that we consider our ethics and our responsibility. As researchers then, that gives us all sorts of questions that we might want to ask, but I'm going to leave today's provocation with 3 questions that I'd like us to consider. One is the question of what do we do with visual social media content as researchers? If we want to save it or present it, if I want to use it in a presentation like this, does just removing a username suffice? Is that enough to de-identify it if that's what we're planning to do? Should we be de-identifying it? In the future, indeed in the present, it's very likely that we'll be able to search images just as readily as we do search text. So does just removing a username suffice if we really don't want that image to be reattached to someone at a later point? We also have the question of changing privacy settings. If a parent shares a lot about their young child, and then later that parent and that child come to an understanding that those images shouldn't be shared in the same way, and the privacy settings on that account change, if we've scraped and collected that content, should we then be rechecking after the fact and checking later, to find out whether the privacy settings have changed, and should we respect that? Should we delete content if we find out the privacy settings have changed, for example? Does the fact that the person who takes the photo owns the copyright and shares it, is that enough to have permission to use that thing? And lastly, what about publication strategies? Should we be sharing full images that we're using as part of our research? Should we be getting explicit permission? We probably should. Should we find other representative ways? Should we just try and describe things rather than having visual images? But how important are they for visual social media? Obviously, they matter quite a lot. One example of something we came up with for this question in the book, when we're talking about children, was to use these sort of line drawings created by an artist, so they give you a sense of what those pictures look like without explicitly using the images in question. Okay, that was a very fast presentation. I'm very sorry about that. Thoughts, questions, comments, please leave them either in the ICA discussion if that's where you are, or if not, please find me on social media. I'm tamaleva.net online. I'm on Instagram or Twitter as Tamaleva, and I hope to hear from you. Cheers.